Welcome to our continuing study of the Bible Jesus read. Tonight we begin the book of Exodus. Exodus is the second of the 5 books attributed to Moses. These 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, constituted the law in Jesus' day. Now that was not all of the Bible that he had. They had also scrolls of the prophets and the Psalms, but they considered the law the most important, and that was what we know as the first 5 books of our Bible. Now, let's recall together how the Israelites came to be in Egypt in the first place. The book of Genesis tells us that story. In the last portion, beginning in about Genesis 37, there is a famine in Palestine, and Jacob's family joins Joseph in Egypt and thereby escapes the famine. Now, for some reason, they stayed down there for well over 400 years. There's a gap of about 400 years between the end of Genesis and the beginning of the book of Exodus. And at the beginning of Exodus, we find an interesting phrase. Scripture tells us there arose in Egypt a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. Well, this probably deals with the revolution that happened in Egypt, and this was the demise of the Hyksos dynasty about 1550 BC, give or take a few years. The Hyksos were Semitic rulers that invaded Egypt from the north and ruled the northern end of Egypt from the Mediterranean coast to down to the headwaters of the Nile. They drove native Egyptians south toward the cataracts of the Nile and ruled there for approximately 100 years. Then the native Egyptians reasserted control over the Nile Delta area, drove the Hyksos out. Thus there arises in Egypt a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. And so that's probably the overthrow of the Hyksos dynasty, the 17th dynasty in Egypt history. And about 1350 BC, give or take a few years, is when the Exodus story takes place. The 2 pharaohs that we're going to hear about were most likely Seti the first and Ramses the second, but we don't know that absolutely for sure. The story in the Exodus begins with the problem that the growing population of Israelites creates for the native Egyptians. And the Pharaoh, who is not named in the Bible, decides that the presence of this large Semitic population on his northeast border is a potential hazard. Remember, the Hyksos invaders were also Semitic, and so the Jews, Israelites being a Semitic people, were considered a potential threat by the native Egyptians. So the solution is to enslave that group of people and create forced labor. The Hebrews are shepherds. They were not then and since have never been builders. So God's answer to this is that he makes the nation of Israel prosper even under the difficult circumstances they find themselves, as we notice in chapter 1, verse 12. Well, they continue to prosper and continue to grow in population, and so the Egyptians come up with an additional control mechanism, and that is in order to kill all the male children when they're born. So they command that the Israelite midwives will kill the male children when they're born, let the females live. Well, these people are not obedient to that command at all, and we have in Scripture a story of 2 of these ladies. Now clearly there were way more than 2 of them, but 2 of them are representative of the group, and they simply fear God and they will not kill the male children. And so we find that these people fear God and they recognize that God is always faithful and he always has his faithful ones, and so they face personal danger rather than obey the order of Pharaoh. So they make the decision that obviously a significant number of them decide to follow God rather than obey Pharaoh. The result is God blesses the midwives and the Hebrew nation, and they continue to grow and continue to prosper. Thus, Pharaoh's plans, which were inspired by Satan, are thwarted. And so the nation of Israel continues to grow in population. Well, there's more to the story. Chapter 2 begins with the story of the birth of Moses. His parents are later identified as Amram and Jochebed of the tribe of Levi, and they start a family in the midst of these perilous times. And notice that this is really interesting. The birth of the national leader comes through a slave mother. The river that was to be the instrument of death, because these children were supposed to be drowned in the Nile, becomes the instrument of saving Moses' life. And the deliverer of the Hebrews grows up in the very household of the one who ordered his death. This story, of course, is a very familiar one, and we'll follow it as the scripture goes along. Against this terrible context of potential death of all these children, Moses is born, and he's hidden by his mother until he's 3 months old. Well, after 3 months, it's a little bit hard to hide a baby boy. And so his mother faces this crisis that involves great personal risk. Now, her solution to this is quite innovative and allows God to demonstrate his providence and sovereignty yet again. And you're familiar, of course, with the basket made of reeds. It's dabbed with pitch, makes it waterproof, and she sets the baby afloat in the Nile close to the area where Pharaoh's daughter takes her morning swim bath, and sets Moses' sister, Miriam, to watch to see what happens to the baby. Now, the Pharaoh's daughter is never named. We don't know who that is, but she becomes a part of God's plan and executes it flawlessly. Notice, please, that God uses whom he will in the furtherance of his will, whether they believe in him or even know him or not. Now, she is clearly willing to disobey the order of her father, and so the eventual leader of the Hebrew nation grows up under the roof of his sworn enemies. Now, from this point, Scripture is silent about the years of Moses' childhood. We really don't know anything about him except what Stephen tells us in Acts 7:22, that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So we can reasonably infer that he was raised in the royal court with privileges attendant to him being a young prince. What we don't know is how or when he came to understand the fact that he was not Egyptian, but rather was Hebrew. Now, with that story, we see a dramatic change of events as he is now a grown man. And in chapter 2, verses 11 and following, we have the situation where Moses kills a slave overseer who is mistreating Hebrew slaves. Now, folks, there are no secrets in this world, and man's plans are never ever sufficient to accomplish God's purposes. As a result of his rash actions of killing this Hebrew slave overseer, Moses is placed under a death sentence, and as a result of that action has to leave and escapes from Egypt to the land of Midian. Now, Midian is not a well-defined area. It's kind of in the northeast portion of the Arabian Peninsula. But Moses clearly is exiled and thought he had his life in order. As the story unfolds, in fact, he does. He tags up with a fellow named Jethro and his daughters, marries one of the daughters, and generally has his life in order. He has his wife, his sons, his flocks, and his extended family. He's left the problem of Egypt and his Hebrew brothers far, far behind. And as he's tending the sheep flock out there near the Mount Sinai one day, he finds an interesting phenomenon. He finds a bush that is on fire, but is not consumed. So, folks, let me remind you that the presence of God causes everything to blaze and burn without being consumed. And so he turns aside to see what this is all about, and therefore he sees what's going on. Well, in verse 6, God identifies himself historically. He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And lets Moses know that he is who he is. That next verse, verses 7 through 10, contain an interesting passage. God says to Moses, I have seen the affliction of my people. I have heard their cries. I have taken heed of their sufferings, and I have come down to rescue them. So far, so good. God has heard, he has seen, he has noticed, taken heed, and he has resolved to take action. Christian, take comfort in the fact that our God is not absentee. He is not off somewhere creating new worlds. He is intensely interested in what's going on in our lives day by day. He sees, he hears, He takes heed and he resolves to take action. In chapter 3, verse 10, though, there's an interesting phrase. God says, "Come now, Moses, I will send you to Pharaoh." The late Reverend E.V. Hill, pastor of one of the large Baptist churches in Los Angeles, California, was preaching on this text of Scripture and used this quote: "Whenever God elects to use man in his plan, he exercises his worst option." I love that. I think that is so neat. Now, God's call to us today is the same as it was to Moses back then. God says to us, "I have seen the problems of this world. I have heard the cries of my people. I have taken heed. I have determined to act. And I have come down to act. Come now, I will send you." In the great providence of God, He has elected to use human beings in His work. And that is the way that He goes forward. Well, Moses immediately begins to argue with him. Moses, first of all, says, "Well, who am I that you would select me?" Little mock humility here, probably well mixed with fear. Moses really does not know what's going on here, and he's certainly not that familiar with God. Probably heard about it from his mother, but that was years ago. And he has his life together, and God has come down to interrupt his routine. And Moses was well aware of the danger that faced him if he went back into Egypt in the power of Pharaoh's court. God's response is, "Moses, I am with you." That is always God's answer, folks, and it is sufficient for us at all times. He wants us to exercise faith in Him. Well, Moses next asks, "Well, who are you? If I go, these Israelites are going to ask me, who is the God that sent them? What shall I say? Who are you? What is your name?" God's response is an interesting one. He responds with a sentence. He says, "I am who I am." Well, the Hebrews took that and made a word out of it, but when they record their Hebrew Bibles, they only record consonants of words. They don't record vowels. And so we have the four vowels which transliterate into English as YHWH. We have made that into the word Yahweh. Maybe that was close, maybe it wasn't, we don't know for sure. It's virtually impossible to translate into English because it's not even a name. It's actually a statement. I am who I am. And it conveys these basic ideas. First of all, God is self-existent. He is dependent on no other being for His existence. Second, He is purposeful and able to accomplish His purposes. We translate that Yahweh as best we can, but that's the basic understanding that the Word gives us of of the nature of God. Well, Moses then begins with some excuses, chapter 4. "People will not listen to me. They're not going to pay attention to what I have to say." To which God gives a response. He gives Moses 3 signs to use to convince people that He indeed did send Moses to accomplish this task. The first sign is, "Cast your staff upon the ground." And Moses takes his shepherd's staff, throws it on the ground, it becomes a snake. Bad enough until God says, "Seize it by the tail." Now, all of us who have had any experience in West Texas with rattlesnake roundups know full well that you do not pick up snakes by the tail. You pick them up, if you're going to pick them up at all, close to the head as you can get, so as to minimize the possibility that you'll get bitten. God says, "Seize the snake by the tail." Moses does, and of course it turns back into his shepherd's staff again. Next thing God says is, "Moses, put your hand inside your tunic." So he does, puts his hand inside his tunic, draws it out, and it is as leprous as it can be. Has a complete case of leprosy covering his hand, but only his hand. Then after that, God says, "Put it back in your tunic," and he does, and it comes out perfectly clean. The leprosy is totally gone. The last one that God promises is that He will turn the water of the Nile into blood. And indeed He does that later on when Moses confronts Pharaoh. Well, Moses' next response is, I just can't do this. I just cannot do this at all. Moses says, I can't speak clearly. I'm not a man of easy speech. And Moses is worried about that, or he says he is, that probably is just a smokescreen. Moses is still not to the point where he's ready to exercise faith in God. God's answer is, I will supply all your needs and take care of your problems. Well, finally, Moses is out of excuses. So in verse 13 and 14, he says, Lord, just send somebody else. Just don't pick me for this. That's too much of an interruption in my life. Just send somebody else. And Moses already knows the answer to that one. In fact, God does not answer it at all. He offers Aaron as a spokesman, and God does not offer any alternatives to Moses at this point. Moses is called, and he must decide whether to follow God's call or turn away. All of us, when we hear God's call, have that same decision to make. We must either follow God's call or turn away. We have the right to turn away. We have the privilege of doing that. God has made us free, and He does not control us like puppets on a string. We can indeed turn away if we wish. Well, Moses does not. He elects to be obedient and return to Egypt. Chapter 4, verses 19 to 31 detail the journey back to Egypt. One wise writer has written these words. Moses spent 40 years in Egypt thinking he was a somebody. He then spent 40 years in Midian learning that he was a nobody. And then he spent 40 years learning what God can do with a nobody. Thought that was pretty cool. Moses died at the age of 120. You couldn't do the math. Well, there's one incident in those few verses of Scripture right there, and that is this meeting on the road. As Moses and his family are headed back to Egypt, Scripture says God met him on the road intending to kill him. And yet Zipporah, his wife, circumcises one of the sons, and that turns away God's wrath. Now, why in the world would that event take place like that? Why would God be so angry about that? Well, because Moses was not being obedient. Moses, as a Jewish man with sons, was required to circumcise his sons on the 8th day. And when he proceeds to start to work back toward the community of God, to undertake God's will while living in a state of disobedience, that is not okay. And God is not going to honor that disobedience. So, as a result of Moses' disobedience, but Zipporah's quick recovery, God's wrath is turned because Moses and his family become obedient. God calls us to holy living. Well, that concludes the first session we're going to do together tonight. I hope you'll continue to join us for subsequent sessions as we deal with the Bible Jesus read.